Hi, good afternoon. I would like to welcome everybody to what I believe will be an interesting opportunity to discuss the challenges and dilemmas that will face the new administration in the Middle East. It is hard to predict where an unpredictable personality may take us. What we are witnessing is the rise of national identity everywhere that counters globalization. And JPPI is becoming highly invested in understanding the challenges this phenomenon poses to the Jewish people. At the beginning of World War II, Winston Churchill, when asked to predict how the Russians would react to German aggression, said, "I cannot forecast to you the reaction of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest. The big question today is how Trump understands and translates the American national interest." So we are back with the enigma. The discussion couldn't take place without our co-chair, Dennis Ross, whose last book, Doomed to Succeed, took a 70-year perspective on US-Israel relations from Truman to Obama. You won't find Donald Trump in the index of the first edition, but you will find him in the newly published paper book. Dennis, it's a great pleasure to have you back, hoping to see you more and more under the new circumstances. My first meeting with Dennis was in 1988 in the transition offices at the DuPont Circle of George Bush the father. Dennis was already a veteran of two administrations. Since then, he has been deeply engaged with the developments in the Middle East, the politics of the region, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. As a journalist, I many times felt split between what I believed was Israel's right to determine its own fate and the American professionals who believed that they knew better what was best for Israel, better than its own politicians. I was also split between the feelings for the land of our forefathers and the reality of ruling a people against its will. What was special about Dennis and his team was that they were willing to take a few steps back in order to see the big picture and keep under control the mutual interests of the two countries, which are so critical to Israel's existence. Here, the role of the American administration was crucial. Today, my worry is that Israel will be embraced in a bear hug by Trump and his nominees that may push us into a corner that could erode the Jewish character of the state. This is the most critical challenge, in my view, as a nationalist Jew and an Israeli, but I'm sure Dennis detects many more of Washington's challenges vis-à-vis the Middle East. I'd like to acknowledge a few special guests. Professor Andrew Viterbi, who is responsible for the Viterbi algorithm. Without it, the world would be a different place. He's visiting Israel to be recognized by the Technion, which named its electrical engineering faculty after Professor Viterbi and his late wife. I would also like to welcome the Knesset member Nachman Shai, who heads the Knesset caucus for US-Israel relations, and Ido Disenchik, chairman of the executive board of the Weizmann Institute of Science. Ido was my editor at Ma'ariv when Ma'ariv was Ma'ariv, and no doubt one of my mentors. I would also like to mention that we have with us the former Canadian ambassador Vivian Berkovich, who fell in love with the country during her tenure and decided to make Aliyah. She will join JPPI as a senior fellow in the new year. So Dennis, I took too much of your time, and now I'll turn the mic to you.
Thank you. It's a little hard to walk and talk, but my people who know me know that I rarely speak anywhere unless I can walk and talk, partly because I walk. I once was on a college campus when I started doing this, and I said I didn't want to play Phil Donahue and I drew completely blank looks because, of course, the demographic was the wrong demographic. So what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to address Israel's dilemmas. That's up to you to address. I am going to address what are America's dilemmas or challenges as they face, as a new administration faces the Middle East. I'm going to start by noting something that may seem counterintuitive. This administration, the Trump administration, will confront a greater set of challenges, a more complex Middle East, than any of its predecessors. Now, the reason I say that may seem counterintuitive, having done a book that looked at every American administration from Truman to Obama, and even though the title is about the U.S.-Israel relationship, the truth is the book was about the U.S. approach to the Middle East. Because, in fact, the key assumptions that guided the approach to Israel was always derivative of the larger views of the region. And I just said that the Trump administration will face a more complicated, more daunting set of challenges than any of its predecessors, even though every single administration from Truman to Obama faced at least one major conflict in the Middle East, sometimes more, and sometimes also at least one major crisis. And if you want to quiz me on that, I'm happy to go through every administration and point out every conflict in every administration. But we'll wait for the Q&A to go over that. So why do I say what this administration is going to face is going to be more daunting, more complicated? Let's just go through a survey of the region. Let's start with that simple problem called Syria. If you look at Syria, this is a war that is not going to end, even with the imminent capture of the remaining part of Aleppo by the Assad administration. And I say by the Assad administration or regime advisedly. Assad has about 20 to 25,000 deployable military forces. The reason that you have such a significant Iranian and Iranian Shia militia presence is precisely because Assad doesn't have the military manpower and hold territory. And because of that, basically what you see is a regime that has the ability to move certain forces to certain areas, but it has to shift them around, and it can't, as I said, hold the territory. You want to get a sense of the role and the centrality of the Iranians? I don't know how many of you know it, but there were pictures of Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, head of the Quds forces of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, in Aleppo a couple of days ago on the front lines in the western part of the city. If that doesn't tell you something about the role of Iran, think about the fact that in the past, Soleimani used to be a very shadowy figure. You didn't see him out in public. Starting in Iraq, we began to see him more and more publicly on the ground. Now you see him in Aleppo, and it's not by accident, it's by design. The purpose is to send the message that Iran is a central player. This isn't just about Syria, it's about the region. So we have an administration that's coming in. The war won't end in Syria, even after Aleppo, because there will be an insurgency. Assad has killed too many people. There are too many insurgent groups, at least 160 militias separate from ISIS. They're not just going to go away, and obviously ISIS is not just going to go away. So the new administration has to come in. It has to deal with what is the immediate aftermath of Aleppo, and even if Vladimir Putin tries to organize at this point, having achieved his main objectives, tries to organize a ceasefire and a political process, it's unlikely to succeed. The effort that he's seeking to create right now is one with Turkey and Iran. If you don't have the Saudis, and you don't have the Qataris, and you don't have the Emiratis, then your ability to influence a majority, I'm not talking about all of the militias, a majority of the opposition is quite limited. The notion that the new administration will come in and team up with Putin, and this will solve the problem in Syria, is obviously one that's been out there because candidate Trump has talked about that. President-elect Trump has talked about that. And I think he will find that that poses some dilemmas for his administration. And I think that his Secretary of Defense designate is likely to point out some of those dilemmas, and maybe we'll see whether his Secretary of State designate will also point out those dilemmas. But what are some of the dilemmas? Let's say you want to team up with Putin. Well, the first thing you're doing is you are abetting Iranian power. When I made a reference to Soleimani's presence in Aleppo, I didn't do that accidentally. I did it quite consciously. You are abetting Iranian power in a region where there is a struggle over the broader balance of power between the Iranians and the Sunni-led governments. So there's an implication there. Our traditional partners in the region are the ones who will see abetting Iranian power as a threat to them. One of the reasons, by the way, our traditional partners have had doubts about the Obama administration is because they've looked at the Obama administration and believed that the president saw Iran, fairly or not, as being part of the solution to the problems in the region, not being a source of the problems in the region. If, in fact, the next administration decides that its answer is to join with Putin and abet Iranian power, then I think you're going to recreate a set of problems, or you're going to make those problems worse with our traditional partners. And it looks like we're coming down on the side of the struggle that is more favorable to Iran. Now, maybe Putin will change his position. If he is to do that, however, I think some leverage will have to be exercised on him by us, and we can discuss that. A second implication from joining with Putin: you still have a fight in Syria with ISIS. You need the Sunnis for that fight with ISIS. Why? Who's going to replace ISIS? Who's going to be responsible for helping to fill the vacuum in the aftermath of ISIS? If it is done by the Shia militias, well, you're going to deepen sectarianism. That is not going to be an answer to ISIS. That's going to help recreate the conditions that produced ISIS in the first place. It's hard to believe that the next administration, and certainly President Trump, is going to want to be in a position where before the end of his term, he's going to have to deal with the next incarnation of ISIS. But the net effect of joining with Putin, if Putin doesn't change his basic posture, is to help recreate the conditions, at least in Syria, that produced ISIS in the first place. So if that were all that the next administration was dealing with in the Middle East, that would be quite enough. If it was Passover, I'd say it would be Dayenu, right? It would be quite enough. But that's not all that the next administration is going to have to deal with. It's going to have to deal with Iraq. It's going to have to deal with ISIS. Right now, given the pace of what's going on in Mosul, which is just a terrible slog, where the casualties that are being taken by the Iraqi military are high, where the Shia militias are not in the center of the city but are around the city, the new administration is going to face, relatively early in its tenure, is going to face, again, the aftermath of ISIS being defeated within Mosul. But the same problems I was talking about as it relates to Syria, and specifically Raqqa, are just as true in Mosul. What's the aftermath of Mosul? Are Sunnis going to share in governance? Is there going to be reconstruction? What's the role of the Shia militias? If the Shia militias play the role they did in Ramadi and Fallujah, where all the young Sunni males basically disappeared, and as I said, we've seen summary executions right now in Aleppo. If this is the result, then again, sectarianism is deepened, and the prospect of facing the next incarnation, son of ISIS, is what the new administration is going to be contending with. Hard to believe that's what it wants to be the result. But here again, a huge challenge. Let's move on to Yemen. A proxy war, effectively, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. If you were paying attention, the King of Saudi Arabia gave a speech a little over a week ago where he made it very clear that the one thing Saudi Arabia was not going to do was to, even though it was calling for the UN to try to produce a ceasefire and a political process, it wasn't going to back off, given what it perceived to be Iran within Yemen. I was in Saudi Arabia at the end of August. In speaking to most of the Saudi leadership, what came through was their perception, very strongly, that they weren't going to do the equivalent of Hezbollah to be created on their border. And by the way, in the last days, there were members of Hezbollah who were captured in Yemen. Just to give you a sense of the perception they have is not one that is wholly made up out of whole cloth. So Yemen is going to be an ongoing problem. The Iranians probably have a continuing incentive to try to bleed the Saudis. The Saudis are making it pretty clear that, you know, whatever the difficulties, they're not about to back off of that. Then there's Egypt. Egypt, a country of 93 million people. Egypt, a country that even though it just got an IMF standby loan, has been facing shortages of sugar, cooking oil, basic foodstuffs. The one thing that no one can afford in this region or outside this region is for Egypt to become a failed or failing state. 93 million people, Egypt becoming a failed or failing state makes what's happening in Syria look like child's play in terms of its implications for Europe and the rest of the region. This is an administration that has to take a look at what's going on in Egypt. It has to make basic judgments. It has to understand what's at stake. It has to probably think a little differently about assistance. It has to put together some kind of collective approach with others to help ensure that Egypt's economic problems are somehow going to be managed. Obviously, you can't do it over Egypt's head. You have to do it with Egypt. You can't dictate to Egypt. But there is a stake here, and the consequences of not addressing it, once again, I think are huge. There is Libya, and I don't need to go into Libya. I haven't said anything about the Palestinians, but somewhere during the time of this administration, maybe not in the early going, you're going to face a succession problem with the Palestinians. What are the implications of that? How likely is that succession to be stable? What is the sustainability of the Palestinian Authority? What are the consequences if it's not sustainable? Here again, this is, I think, a large challenge that the next administration is going to face. I talked about Iran sort of, you know, indirectly in terms of its challenge to the region, but the Iranians are using Shia militias as a lever to basically challenge every Sunni regime wherever those Shia militias are. What I didn't say is if you look at Syria, they are importing Shia militias from as far away as Afghanistan. This, too, is going to be part of the landscape that the next administration is going to face. What you see in the region is a challenge to the state system itself. If the state system somehow breaks down, then you have enormous operational space for groups like ISIS or terror groups to operate. So that looks like it's, to say the least, a complicated, daunting set of challenges that the next administration is going to face. Are there any assets that it also might be confronting? Are there any potential opportunities? The answer is yes. I mean, if I stopped only where I was, I'd leave you all feeling completely depressed. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of developments that are potential assets if the new administration understands them and can take advantage of them. One is the convergence, the strategic convergence of Israel and a number of the Sunni-led governments. Now, it's not for the first time that some might say that there's a convergence of strategic interests. For those of you who have read my book, you can go back to the Reagan administration and you can see that Alexander Haig came in and he said there was strategic alignment in the region between Israel and the Arab states because you just had the Islamic Revolution in Iran, you had the Soviet threat. And while that conceptually was the case, you didn't see it translated in practical terms. That's not true today. Today, actually, you do see it being translated in practical terms, even if the level of cooperation is largely below the radar screen. Certainly for the states in the Arabian Peninsula, they are preoccupied with the threat of Iran, and they look around for who is a strategic partner or a strategic bulwark against Iran, and they see Israel. And when you look at Egypt and Jordan, there's no question that the threats they see from jihadis, whether they're ISIS or not, here again, Israel is a natural partner, and the level of cooperation, again, even if not broadcast, And in the case of the Arabian Peninsula, or in the case of the Gulf states, the Palestinian issue does weigh on them to the extent that they're not about to broadcast what they do with the Israelis or the level of cooperation. But the fact is that doesn't make the cooperation any less real. Now, that cooperation is an asset for a new administration along two different dimensions. One is vis-a-vis the Iranians and jihadi threats on the one hand, and potentially on the Palestinian issue as well. Why do I say potentially on the Palestinian issue? Well, I say it from a couple of different standpoints. One standpoint is I don't think the model of strictly bilateral negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians works, at least for the time being. On the Palestinian side, even negotiating with Israel is somehow defined as a concession today. So if that's a concession, even if you could bring them to the table, what could they actually do if they were at the table? They need some kind of Arab cover. On the Israeli side, given the perception of the Palestinians that any concession that Israel would make towards the Palestinians won't produce anything in response, the only thing that might be worth making those concessions would be what you get from the Arabs. So if you could bring the Arabs in as a kind of, into the negotiations in some fashion, a cover for the Palestinians, a partner for the Israelis, this might be a way to begin to do something on the peace issue. I say might because I don't know whether at this point the issue is important enough for the leading Arab states to expose themselves. Does it matter enough to them right now? I don't think the answer to that is one that anybody knows. I don't think we should presume one way or the other. The new administration should probe this quietly, not with a large, big public initiative. Big public initiatives on the peace issue, certainly if they're not prepared, you can guarantee they do is they drive everybody to their maximal positions, either their maximal positions or the fetal position, one or the other. So the point is, private and see from the Arab states what would they require from the Israelis on the Palestinian issue to play a certain kind of role and be responsive to the Israelis. From the Israeli side, what would you require from the Arab states to be able to do certain things towards the Palestinians that the Arab states might require? Again, that's best done privately, not in public. But it is a potential opportunity. The Arab states will not be a substitute for the Palestinians, but they may play a role where they can be a cover for them and be responsive to the Israelis. So here, this strategic realignment, the strategic convergence of interests creates a potential, a very practical potential for sure, vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis radical jihadis, and potentially on the Palestinian issue as well. Okay, so that's one development in the region that is potentially significant and could be a real asset for the new administration. There's a second one, and that's what's going on in Saudi Arabia. You know, when I was in Saudi Arabia, one of the senior people I saw said, "Welcome to our revolution disguised as economic reform." There is a dramatic change taking place in Saudi Arabia. You see it in terms of what's been done to the religious police. They're not allowed to detain, arrest, or interrogate. They're not allowed to go into the malls right now. You see it in terms of the decision to take Aramco public, because when you take it public, you have to create transparency, and that means it can't be anybody's private piggy bank. You see it in terms of the commitment to diversifying the sources of the economy and getting away from a strictly oil-based economy. See it in terms of the cuts in subsidies and the reduction in salaries. You see it in terms of the kind of work ethic, in terms of what is being brought, how people are being, how the character of their efforts are being made, the intensity of them. You see it in terms of an effort to overhaul their educational system. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't going to be a backlash. It doesn't mean there isn't going to be resistance. We've seen in this past week, we saw a young woman who decided to use Twitter without a headscarf, and she was arrested. You know, there is going to be resistance from those within the religious establishment. There is going to be resistance from those within the family who see the whole basis of development being transformed, the whole character of the kind of political social contract that has existed, potentially being risky from their standpoint. But what's driving the Saudis, at least the Saudi leadership that is pushing this, is the perception if they don't change, they face a higher threat. Now, again, think about the implications of Saudi's success with their national transformation plan. There has never been a successful model of development or modernization in the Arab world. I'm pausing for effect. A successful model of development that is translatable to the rest of the region. Saudi Arabia has the potential to do that. We have seen, since Nasser's time, a constant set of pretenders, whether they were national secular types, or they were the Muslim Brotherhood, where Islam was the solution, Islam is the answer, or they're ISIS, who says they're perfecting Islam, and they are divine messengers. They're all basically claiming that they're going to be the ones to restore greatness lost. You say since the year 1000, that's the point. There is a perception, a deep perception, and a longing for greatness lost, and nobody has had. And here the Saudis are trying to produce what is a serious effort to modernize and reconcile it with Islam. If they succeed, it has implications beyond Saudi Arabia. So the new administration has a stake in that, and there are ways it can help. So against this daunting array of challenges that the new administration is going to confront and has to recognize, there also are potential assets. Can they take advantage of the assets? Do they understand, will they understand the character of the challenges? That remains to be seen. I'll just conclude with the following thought. Anybody who thinks they know what the new administration is going to do, I would say, I would put them in the same category as all those experts who knew exactly what our election was going to produce. If there was ever a time for humility, this is it in terms of making predictions, which is why I didn't make any predictions here. All I did is outline what are the dilemmas and the challenges, but I also outlined what are the potential assets that a new administration can bring to bear. And with that, I will stop and take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
And I know this is a group that is not shy.
Thank you so much for your brilliant.
There is an assumption in your view that a group of same people will take over the administration in the United States and will act according to the restriction of what you just said, whether it's correct or not. But from what we know, from what they say, and from what they do, and from what they tweet, there is no connection between any rational, logical behavior, capabilities, and what they will do here or anywhere else.
First, I didn't assume anything about them. No, I didn't. If you look, I said this is what they're going to face. That's what I said. This is what they're going to face. That's a reality. That's a landscape. Now, what I raised was if you decide to team up with Putin in Syria, I outlined some of the implications of that. What are the consequences of that? Now, we don't know what they're going to do once they actually have the responsibility, number one. What we do know is that Mattis was head of CENTCOM, and he certainly has a view of Iran. You know, is he going to be defining? Will he be the one who determines? We don't know what the sociology of this administration is going to be. What I mean by that is we don't know, will Donald Trump decide that he will be the chairman of the board and he will delegate? Could, maybe. Will he decide that he has to make every decision? He's made a decision, he doesn't have to get intelligence briefings every day. Now, does that mean that he's ready to defer to the people who will be his key cabinet positions? I don't know. All I'm saying is these are the challenges he's going to face, and here are some of the assets that he could use. Now, maybe they'll do things, maybe they'll have their own way of doing business. I'm sure they will, but the question is, Well, okay, on the Iran deal, he said scrap it and enforce it. Those are two contradictory things. Okay? So which of those does he mean? On the Israelis and Palestinians, he said this is the ultimate deal. He said he would like to be the one to be able to make peace, and I'm quoting, and he had reason to believe he could do so. Okay? I'm just saying this, there are words that are out there that have some sets of implications. But it's one thing to say things before you're president, something else when you're president. So again, I don't know. We will see. What I was trying to do was, here's what he's going to face. And, you know, maybe he will adjust certain things as he approaches it. When he deals with Putin, is he someone who's going to decide that he shouldn't have any leverage? He sees himself as a deal maker. Can you make any deals with no leverage? We'll see.
I wanted to ask you, I mean, you said that you don't know what kind of manager will he be, but there is a record. He's already running business and other things in his career. How did he do at the time? Was he the chairman of the board, or was he involved in every single decision made in his various operations?
You get different accounts. And you get, in some cases, he seems to have been much more the chairman of the board. In other cases, he seems to have been much more hands-on. So while there certainly is a record, the record is one that tends to show elements of both. Yeah. I can hear you, so.
I'm fascinated by the way that you presented that, because I want to ask you now in a question of policy. So next U.S. administration, and you presented all of these different challenges, would you say touch or not touch? Because in a sense, you were talking about being involved, but there's also a choice of not being involved. And I'd kind of like you to explore the idea of what would be the implications of being involved, because when you touch something, you don't know what's going to come out. But when you don't touch things, and that's also a choice, it also has implications, if you could address that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always the cost of action, there's always the cost of inaction. Syria is a good example of the cost of inaction. And we know, again, going back to things that Trump as candidate said, he doesn't want, and even as president-elect, he doesn't want to do nation building. He's very suspicious of getting caught up in Middle East wars, and yet he says he's going to knock the bejesus or the shit out of, to quote him, out of ISIS. So it's hard to know, again. I mean, look, if you look at what he's said about foreign policy and national security, you don't have a whole lot to go by. It's at a high level of generality at this point. So there are implications if he decides to draw back. I mean, some of the statements he's made could imply an impulse to retrench. Are the two cabinet appointments that he's made for defense and state, are they indicative of someone who's inclined to draw back? I don't think so. So it's, you know, there are implications from which path you choose, and it's possible also you do something and if it doesn't work, that has an impact on you. President Obama came in and was profoundly affected by the Iraq War, no question. In fact, I mean, if you go back to the Goldberg article, there's one place where when he talks about Syria and he's asked the question, if it hadn't been for Iraq, would your approach have been different? And he says probably. Context matters. So, you know, partly the context will matter, partly also, you know, what the president decides are his most important priorities. It seems his most important priorities are more domestic, but maybe ISIS, you look at, I didn't mention what happened in Berlin yesterday, or even what happened in Ankara yesterday. You know, the world has a way of imposing itself. And again, it's one thing when you're not yet president, when you become president and you're confronted with these realities, how you respond to them may be different than where you were before. Suddenly you have the responsibility.
Since you said you can't predict, I want to ask you how serious is Trump about moving the embassy to Jerusalem? But if he's calling you and asks you, look, I want to do that, please tell me what are the implications for that? What are the risks and what are the pros for that?
I would say, I'd say the following. Look, there's on the one hand, I would tell him the history. I'd go through that. But then I'd say, logically speaking, no one questions whether West Jerusalem will be part of Israel. I mean, the only people who do that question whether Israel should be here at all. So you don't take those views. Those you reject. So no one questions whether West Jerusalem will be part of Israel. In theory, he could say, I'm not going to change the status of Jerusalem. I'm simply going to move our embassy to where the seat of the government is. And I'm doing this not because I'm trying to preempt what the ultimate status of Jerusalem will be. And I would say that's a logical position and it's something you could explain. But if you want to do it, I would still say don't rush into doing it. You need to prepare the ground. You need to get everybody used to this. It would be good if you could actually convince a few other countries to do it at the same time with you as a way of saying this is a reasonable thing to do. Obviously, I don't, sitting here in Jerusalem, I don't need to tell you, Jerusalem is a highly emotional issue. And it's a highly emotional issue not just in Israel, it's also a highly emotional issue with the Palestinians and the Arabs. Take these Sunni, the Sunni governments I was talking about. You think these governments that are all cooperating with the Israelis, you think that they're going to be happy about the idea of doing this? You think that they might not feel that they're going to be exposed on an issue that you might be able to explain rationally, but maybe they feel their public won't understand that? How about the Palestinians? How are they going to respond to it? You don't have to let your own behavior be determined by that, but you should be aware of it. In 1996, not the same issue, but again, just to make it concrete and to highlight this notion that things are not always rational or explainable. In 1996, a tunnel was opened. I was our negotiator at the time. A tunnel was opened. And it didn't touch the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, didn't touch it. But it triggered, and all it was you had a tunnel that existed. And all they were doing was opening an outlet within part of the old city. And it triggered riots for more than a week. Now maybe, as I said, you can prepare the ground. Maybe you can get everybody used to the idea. But I think anytime you touch Jerusalem, you should touch it carefully, and you should prepare the ground. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you should think through how you're going to do it and what some of the potential consequences might be.
Yeah. Dennis, you talked a great deal about the challenges that the new administration is going to face in the Middle East. But before you get to the Middle East, it's also going to face qualitatively new challenges vis-a-vis Russia, not just because Russia is in Syria, but because it is deployed in a totally different way now than it has been over the last years. It also, presumably, the new administration will have to define its relationship with China, and also with the Europe that is more kind of like inward-looking with its own challenges, having to face a great deal of security threats and not necessarily being open to it, and facing a Trump administration that will presumably want more burden sharing. So how do you kind of like gauge these challenges and how they will impact on the priorities of the administration when it comes to the Middle East?
Because I didn't have 2 hours, I chose not to deal with all those. But look, there's no question that you have the reality of a more assertive Russia and a more assertive China. In some ways, I suspect that the Taiwanese phone call was not an accident. I suspect it was probably designed to send a signal that the administration is going to be tougher in its posture towards China. Personally, I would have preferred to pick a different issue to signal being tougher on. I would have preferred to signal on an issue where we might actually be prepared to use force, not one where they might be most prepared to use force, meaning North Korea. If nothing changes, we might be put in a position where we can't accept an outcome where before the end of this term, North Korea might be able to put a nuclear warhead on an ICBM missile. I would like to see this administration make it very clear that that's not an outcome that it can tolerate. Anyway, the point is, I do think you're facing a more assertive China and a more assertive Russia. How we position ourselves towards both, I think, is important. I think one of the things that needs to be done with both is a readiness to signal where we're prepared to be a little tougher. In a lot of ways, I think that Putin made a judgment about President Obama that on a lot of issues he was self-deterred, meaning he wouldn't provide lethal assistance to Ukraine, self-deterred, because Russia had escalation dominance. He wouldn't get involved in Syria, and once Russia became more involved in Syria, then it became too difficult, self-deterred. Even on the issue of Russian hacking and intervention in the election, there seems, again, the president has acknowledged a kind of restraint. Trump likes to say he's unpredictable. And Thomas Schelling, who was the author of The Rationality of Irrationality, who just died this week, there's a certain logic to having a degree of unpredictability as long as, in fact, there's something that's always guiding it. So I suspect that, the new administration has people in it who have different levels of appreciation. I mean, obviously there's question. Tillerson has done a lot of business with the Russians. Does that mean somehow, because he got the Order of Friendship, that means that he's just going to be soft towards them? I'm not sure it implies that. Mattis not only has adopted a position vis-a-vis the Iranians that was tougher than many in the Obama administration were comfortable with, but his position towards the Russians was similar. I think being prepared to adopt a position with both that says, look, where our interests converge, we're going to maximize and try to promote those. Where our interests diverge, we're going to try to manage our differences. But the relationship's going to be a reciprocal relationship. It's going to be a two-way street. I think that's an important thing for this administration to convey to both. Both, for their own reasons, might have an interest actually in managing things a little differently with us, not necessarily in a way that is bad from the American standpoint. Putin right now has changed the balance of power in Syria and has achieved, I think, most of his objectives, not most, his objectives in Syria. What has he got? When Aleppo, when the rest of Aleppo is taken, which appears to be imminent, all the major population centers down the western spine of Syria will be under the control of the regime, even though it may take Shia militias manpower to be able to actually occupy them. From Putin's standpoint, he'll have access to an air base, he has access to a naval facility, he now has created an air defense capability that extends an umbrella over the eastern Mediterranean. He looks like he's the arbiter of events there. He doesn't need this insurgency to go on, so he's ready, I think, for a ceasefire and a political process. The bad news for him is that he really doesn't have leverage over most of the opposition. And as I said at the outset, Turkey alone can't deliver most of the opposition. Well, interestingly enough, President Trump could go to President Putin and say, I said all along I'm ready to cooperate with you. We face certain common enemies, especially ISIS. But, for me to kind of help you out here in terms of a political process, I have to be able to bring Turkey, the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis along. And here's what it takes to bring them along. That means he has some leverage if he's prepared to use it. Gets back to your question, is he prepared to use it? I don't know. But with the Russians or with the Chinese, I think in each case, he has the potential for some leverage. China's a little bit more complicated. But I'd say where the leverage ironically may come is on North Korea. Now, I didn't mention Europe. You know, in a lot of ways, while some of his language was obviously extreme, you know, you had Bob Gates in his farewell speech to the Europeans saying, you have to be prepared to spend more on your own defense. What kind of an alliance is it when you're not meeting a threshold of credibility and spending for your own defense? You had President Obama also raising the issue of, I mean, he used the term free riders. You know, I'm not saying it's the same because the language that you saw in the campaign was different, but, you know, the notion of burden sharing, I can tell you, going back to the first administration I was a part of in my history, most, I like to say you can tell something about somebody's age when, you know, they're a specialist on a country called the Soviet Union that doesn't exist anymore, although Putin's doing his best to recreate it. You know, burden sharing is not a new concept. Maybe the way he talked about it in the campaign was, but it means, you know, again, there can be signs of continuity in terms of how he approaches the Europeans as well. And he has, I would say, in Mattis, who is a big believer in the value of alliances, he's going to have some people who obviously embody that attitude. Now, what's the relative strength they have? How does he, as I said, what's the decision-making process? These are things that we'll only see in time.
Positive view of the leadership. However, there's a long, widely held feeling in the West that Saudi Arabia, over and above their lack of human rights, and, et cetera, they've never done anything themselves. They have to hire Indians and Pakistanis and people from all over the world. They set up this great King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, and where do they get their president from Caltech? Where do they get their faculty from the Western world? How are these people going to really make an impact?
I think, look, the question is great because it reflects, in a sense, what the reality of Saudi Arabia has been over time, but it also reflects their own analysis of their own problems. A, they're trying to do more now indigenously and less with people from the outside, expatriates. B, they talk about 80 to 100,000 students they have a year just in the United States. C, they're talking about kind of wanting many of them to stay for management interns so that they acquire a kind of what I would call as a certain approach to how you do business. I'm not saying the problems aren't daunting. I'm not saying the progress is going to be linear. But what I'm saying is the impulse for change in Saudi Arabia is not coming from the outside. One of our problems over time has been when we've sought to create change from the outside. Every time we've tried to do that, we haven't succeeded in it. Change that is driven from the inside has much more of a chance to succeed. As I said, they're going to face certain domestic sources of opposition, but they seem to recognize it. You know, 70% of their population is under the age of 30. They have the highest per capita use of Twitter on the planet. When they made this decision on the religious police, the Twitter sphere lit up favorably. Part of the reason I think that the Mohammed bin Salman, the Deputy Crown Prince, has been pressing ahead is not just because he has the backing of the king, his father, but also because there's a perception that a lot of what he was doing was actually popular, and especially with the young people. Now, the cutting back of subsidies, the reduction of salaries, probably not so popular. But again, you know, what's happening with younger people there is, in a sense, I think one of his sources of potential strength at this point. Is it enough to succeed? I don't know, but what I was suggesting is we have a stake in their success.
During the campaign, Trump's main slogan was "Making America Great Again." Do you, or Trump, or anyone else, have an idea, even a vague idea, of what he means by that?
I'm certainly not in a position to be his spokesman. Yeah, I mean, look, I think he ran a campaign based on a kind of premise that a significant part of the American public was hurting, was not getting the benefit of globalization. Avinoam started off by talking about some of the work that's being done here now on nationalism, populism, increased identity-based politics. Well, he was playing upon the fears of displacement. He was playing upon those who I think felt dislocated by globalization. And in a sense, I think what he was suggesting is that all those who have felt left out, he was going to recreate an economy that would absorb them and would produce the greatness of America again.
Does he need a more religious America?
It's hard to say. You could easily interpret it as someone who is more inclined to withdraw from the outside. But I think you can argue this all sorts of ways. Until he's president, you begin to see the policies, it's hard to know.
Following this on Iran, you said he's either going to force it or scrap it. Don't you think that his policy on this issue is going to be opposite to the one of Obama? He's not going to see this as a big success. He's going to look for changing it one way or another. Maybe just waiting for the Iranians to make some sort of mistake and with the neighboring to change it, or initiate the change. What do you think is going to happen? How it's going to implications going to have on the...
Well, I think he does want to demonstrate a difference from Obama, for sure, on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But he can demonstrate a difference from Obama by emphasizing enforcement. When the Iranians exceeded the amount of heavy water they're permitted to twice under the JCPOA, the administration didn't highlight this. The fact that we still don't really have what was called for in the JCPOA, a procurement channel on dual-use items, has certainly not been highlighted. The ballistic missile testing, while a letter was done, not very much has been done, in fact. There's a lot of room for some action on his part where he wouldn't be walking away from the JCPOA, but he could be, in each of these areas, he could be going to, since this wasn't a bilateral agreement, this was a 5+1 negotiated understanding with the Iranians. If he wants to be sure that he doesn't make America the issue rather than Iran's bad behavior, he can highlight each of these things, but he can go to the other members of the 5+1 and say, look, these are things that shouldn't be happening. And here's what, let's work on it together. If you're not prepared to take certain steps, we'll take certain steps. He can demonstrate a difference without walking away from the JCPOA. Mattis gave a statement, not before he was announced, where he made it clear he thinks it's a mistake to walk away from it. So we'll see. I think he has a lot of, I guess my answer to you, Yossi, is he has a lot of things he can do that demonstrate a difference without scrapping the JCPOA.
No, I think we all agree that we do not know. And when Trump says that you would like to be unpredictable, this may be another way of saying that he doesn't know either. So this may be a tall order. But there's no doubt that the perception of American power has been diminished because of the lack of credibility of some things that were done by Obama. There's no doubt about it. Can you imagine on issues like Syria or Ukraine or the Baltics or anything else where Trump can do something that may reassert American credibility without going to the brink?
I can imagine him. The question is whether he's going to do the issues. Again, given what he said about the Russians and Putin, I don't know. I mean, my own preference would be you can work with the Russians even while establishing leverage. My argument would be you're more likely to be successful in working things with the Russians if you do recreate leverage. But I mean, I'll give you one area, just not on the Russians, but on Iran. Some of the things I was describing that you raised, but how about we do a much more active interdiction of Iranian efforts to provide arms to the rest of the region? First of all, they're not supposed to be doing it under the existing, even under 2231, the resolution that replaced all the preceding ones on Iran. That would be an interesting manifestation of reasserting American power. He could do certain things that make it clear that there's not going to be a hesitancy on our part. We're not going to be self-deterred. Now, whether he chooses to do it in some of the issues you raised, does it on Iran, I think in some ways Iran is more natural for him because it fits more with some of the things that he has said. But we'll have to see. I do think that he's going to look for opportunities to demonstrate that he's different. Now, will those all be foreign policy? Probably not.
Part of the zeitgeist is this anti-elite sentiment that I think that Trump was exploited very effectively, and other people, Marine Le Pen, etc. And that seems to find expression also in foreign policy to a certain extent by being somewhat derisive of the existing foreign policy institutions and establishments, including the intelligence agencies, foreign ministry. I think that has also affected the way Prime Minister Netanyahu has conducted his foreign policy with the use of personal emissaries and private counsel. So I'm wondering, do you think, A, is this assessment correct? B, does this change in institutions or the institutional conduct of foreign policy, could it have any substantive effects, any substantive results? A different kind of foreign policy, with different sorts of considerations being considered.
Look, I think part of the reaction to globalization, not just in the United States, but obviously in Europe as well, has been a kind of rejection of elites, a rejection of the so-called experts, a feeling that somehow things have gone badly and they have presided over things going badly. So some of what you're saying, I think, is not unique to the United States right now. Was Trump as a candidate able to take advantage of that? Absolutely. As president, how will he approach it?
Well, he's made appointments from his inner circle. I mean, the ambassador to Israel and the secretary of the army are people that haven't come up through the establishment. They're people that owe their appointment to their to connections with the president-elect.
Right, but that's not unusual. Presidents make appointments of people who have been in inner circles, not always have come up through the establishment. That's not unusual per se. I mean, having someone like Tillerson as a Secretary of State looks like he's going outside the norm. Mattis, Secretary of Defense, also, because he actually has to get a congressional waiver to appoint someone. If you've been in the military within 7 years, you have to have a congressional waiver. So he is, I think his appointments do reflect an effort on his part to signal that he's not picking the same old faces. Now the question you're asking is, what does that mean for the institutions? It depends how the people he's appointed are going to run them. Are they going to run them based upon bringing in their own small coterie of assistants and aides, in which case you rely less on the institution and more on the people you bring in? Are they going to run them by reaching into the institutions and drawing on them? I suspect that Mattis and the Pentagon will be will rely more heavily on the institution because he's a product, at least of the military side of that. Tillerson, it's an interesting question because he's going to come at this having had a lot of experience on the world stage, but not with the issues that he's going to contend with on a daily basis. So this is a guy who has obviously, having spent his career in Exxon, he was deeply rooted in understanding every issue, every item, every degree of expertise he had to draw on from within a vast corporation, which, from engineering to science to acquisitions to, the financial side of it, he drew on a very wide array of different expertise. Is he not going to take advantage of what is within the State Department institution? I don't know. I'd be surprised, but there's been a lot of things that happened this year that surprised me. So we have to stay tuned.
What do you think about the Friedman pick?
This is what I think about the Friedman pick. Well, obviously, not the norm. I don't know. Look, it's but I'd say, like with most things, I think there's a context here. Some people have reacted by saying, the sky's going to fall. I've been in the foreign policy making business for a long time. Ambassadors provide inputs. They're not decision makers. The responsibility of ambassadors is to carry out policy, not to make it up. They can try to influence it. They're obviously reporting from their locale, saying, look, here's what I see from here. But the ambassador is not a decision maker. And in the first instance, the ambassador answers to the Secretary of State. So he has a relationship with the president. I think we have to kind of maintain some perspective on what the role actually is. Having said what the role actually is, I'd also, as ambassador, he's representing the United States here. As someone who's Jewish, the one thing he said that I think is beyond the pale is what he said about J Street. I'm here in the JPPI. This is the Jewish People Planning Institute. If there's one thing that comes through in all the work of the JPPI, it's how you create greater unity among diversity in the Jewish people. How do you deal with pluralism and create a big enough tent for a small people not to be excluding some? As the American ambassador to Israel, who happens to be Jewish, he'll have to deal with every aspect, every element of Israeli society, not only one. And because lots of Jewish delegations, he also should be dealing with all those Jewish delegations as well, and not being exclusive. So, I guess my view of him is that some of the things he said in the context of a campaign, I'm hoping that those were in the context of a campaign. And when you're going to have, he too is going to be operating, or will need to operate a little differently. And we'll see. I think he's saying we'll see a lot.
That's the problem. I don't think you can give these people a second chance.
First of all, they have no responsibility yet. When they have responsibility, then you'll see. If they act in a certain way, then you respond to it.
Just run away.
You don't run away. You call them on it. But before they have responsibility, that's something different.
All right, so I run that picture of basketball you're waiting for. You were sitting in our shoes, right? We know a lot of things about, we don't know what's coming. But you're planning things from this end. How do you approach it?
Well, excellent question. I would say this, for those, when I started by saying anybody who thinks they know what the administration is going to do, I wouldn't listen to them. you know, everybody who thinks they know. Right. Well, I just say I would be, you know, those who are suggesting caution on the part of the Israeli government right now, they're the smart ones. You don't know, you know, a lot of things get said during campaigns. I've witnessed them over a lot of years. So, you know, the idea that, I know some on the right feel, oh, we got a blank check now to go do anything we want. Don't be so sure. And, you know, I think you have to, and you certainly don't want to do something with a new president whose instinct is probably to be warm towards Israel, to set a very different tone towards Israel. If you do something that he would find as potentially problematic or embarrassing, then you might, especially from this particular president, you might produce an overreaction. So I would say those who advise caution at this point, not to be presenting this new president-elect with facts, I don't even say facts on the ground, be a little careful. You don't know exactly what the response is going to be, and you certainly, at this point, ought to realize that, again, he's going to be surrounded by a variety of different actors. And what they're going to suggest to them and whose advice he's going to take, that really remains to be seen.
Well, if there are not more questions, then I would like to thank everybody, and especially Dennis for your forward to the things to come.